We are finally at our lecture in metamaterials, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of folks from the internet looking at this. So I really need to be honest right up front. This is a 1 hour-ish lecture on metamaterials. This is not going to be a comprehensive, in-depth discussion of them. But I think having gone through this, you will have a conversational knowledge of metamaterials. You'll certainly be more aware of what people are doing. And at the end of this, I'll let you know a little bit of what we're doing here at University of Texas El Paso. I will briefly introduce metamaterials, talk about what they are compared to photonic crystals and ordinary materials. We've already covered that, but I will mention that again. There are roughly two broad categories of metamaterials, the resonant type and the non-resonant type. And I will briefly touch on what I think are the most commonly discussed metamaterials in the literature, but by no means is this a comprehensive survey of all the different metamaterials that people are working on. But understanding this, you'll be well equipped to look at other things people are doing and understand that much more quickly. So the first thing, what is a metamaterial? And interestingly, that I can tell, there really is no universally accepted definition. And if you talk to 10 different people, you will get 10 different definitions. Many people lump photonic crystals in with metamaterials. Many people don't. I personally would like to see photonic crystals or electromagnetic bandgap materials listed as a subset of metamaterials, but I'd have to say probably more people do not want that classification than do. With that said, there certainly are some themes to definitions that arise. One is that they're engineered composites. So we have a structure that we have somehow purposely formed or engineered in some way to give us the electromagnetic properties we want. We don't just go outside in nature and pick up a rock, and if it behaves the right way, we call it a metamaterial. This is a purposely engineered thing. A second theme is that the properties that come from the metamaterial are certainly indirectly related to the materials they're made from, but they're more derived from how they're structured. So for example, this little picture on the right here has metal rings. It turns out this will give it an artificial permeability. It's not, while there's metals in it, it's not behaving like a metal. It's really more behaving like something with a permeability. So that arises from its structure, not necessarily the underlying materials, which in this case is probably just some kind of plastic and metal. The other theme, which I'm not really sure should be part of the definition of a metamaterial, is that it exhibits properties not observed in nature. And the reason I disagree with that, I think we could design a metamaterial that behaves just like something we could get from nature. I would still call it a metamaterial. I might ask why we're using that and not just using the naturally occurring material, which probably would cost a lot less and be less expensive and easier to use. But that also pops up a lot as a theme. Another, and the last one I'll point out here, which really is important to me for a definition, is this sense of emergence of properties. If we mix material A, which has property A, and material B with property B, and we mix those two together, suddenly we get properties C, D, and E. New properties that have emerged out of this mixture that didn't exist in either one of the two. I'm taking a stab at a definition, and I say it is a composite material that is purposely engineered to provide material properties that are not otherwise attainable with ordinary materials. This is why we would want to use metamaterials. Somehow we are not able to get those properties from ordinary materials, so what we have to do is get those properties by purposely engineering some kind of composite. As I mentioned, there's two broad classes. On the left, we have the resonant type metamaterials. In a metamaterial, as we're defining it, the periodicity is too small for the wave to scatter between the adjacent elements. So it's not a wave scattering phenomenon. The wave itself is not resonant. But very often there's metallic elements, and a wave propagating past that induces oscillating currents, that element itself is resonant, would re-radiate little tiny secondary waves which combine with the applied wave out of phase, and we get some kind of interesting response. So I'll say the period is somewhere around 1/10 of a wavelength. Obviously that can fluctuate a little bit, and most metamaterials are of metallic construction, and the oscillating currents in the conductors really emulate atomic scale resonances. So in a resonant metamaterial, there is something resonating. There's an oscillating current or something like that, but it's not the waves scattering between the different elements. In the non-resonant metamaterial, the period in fact is much less than a wavelength. And for these, the period can be a millionth of a wavelength, and it will behave the exact same way as if the period is 1/10 of a wavelength. My experience with these is that we can push this and get up to about 1/4 wavelength, but as we start approaching the scale of a wavelength, it starts looking much more like a photonic crystal, and a different set of physics takes over. So for these non-resonant type of metamaterials, the cutoff frequency really is where it begins to become resonant. So I'll say 1/10 of a wavelength, although my experience is we can push that a little bit further, but the periodicity can be a millionth or a billionth of a wavelength, and they will work the exact same way. There's no current that's oscillating, there's no waves bouncing around. They derive their properties simply due to where the power is. I do want to mention some benefits of the non-resonant type metamaterials. Other than the hyperbolic metamaterials, these really are not getting as much attention in the literature, but the hyperbolic certainly are. That's an exciting area right now. But I think these have the greatest potential to be broadband simply because they work from DC up to the cutoff, and the cutoff is where it starts to look like a photonic crystal, where the lattice is becoming resonant. Also, I think these have the greatest potential for being have a wide field of view, again going back to the non-resonant nature. These certainly have the smallest feature sizes. As I mentioned, the period of the lattice can be a millionth of a wavelength, and they will work just fine, assuming we can make something that small. In my experience, these are the most robust to structural deformation, so anytime we manufacture something, it does not come out looking perfect. These are very robust to that. There is sort of a drawback in these non-resonant metamaterials. They tend to have less magical properties, and by magical I'm talking about left-handed, negative refractive index, 0 epsilon, these type of extreme, almost magical properties. The non-resonants are a little bit more boring, and there's less magic to them, yet I think their applications are huge, and they're very broadband and can do some amazing things. On to our first category, the resonant type of metamaterials. Let's review what we talked about in one of the first few lectures, and let's talk about the dielectric response of a material. We have electron clouds bound to a nucleus, so it's a bound charge, and without any applied electric field, we have this electron cloud in its neutral state, if you will. As soon as we apply an electric field, that electron cloud stretches and displaces, and we would call this atom polarized. And of course, if we apply an electric field to a material, millions of atoms become polarized, and we say that the material is polarized and it's storing electric energy. If we release the electric field, that electron cloud sort of sloshes back to its neutral position, but it bounces back and forth like a mass on a spring. Now this oscillating charge radiates a little tiny secondary wave. That wave combines with the applied wave out of phase and produces an overall slowing response due to the interference, and this is averaged over millions and billions of atoms, and we call that the dielectric response of a material. Similarly, we can have a magnetic response of a material. Here, the electron motion is restricted in a way that it tends to circulate. So think of a planet orbiting the sun. But we know that circulating charges induce a magnetic field at the center of that circulation. So we get this little magnetic dipole. Well, if we apply a magnetic field to that, these can align. and they tilt from their default position. And now we're storing energy, magnetic energy, in a material. If we let go with that magnetic field, these aligned dipoles then scatter again. They tilt in whatever direction they were, and it's also resonant. And as they oscillate back and forth, they radiate little tiny secondary waves that combine with the applied wave out of phase. We get an overall slowing response, and we would describe that as a magnetic response of a material. So this is all stuff we discussed in the second or third lecture in this lecture series. But the reason this is important, because now we're going to talk about metamaterials and how they work, and what you'll see is that they parallel how ordinary materials are working. Also recall, making an analogy of a mass on a spring, this electron cloud stuck to a nucleus, we can write an equation of motion for it. And that was called the Lorentz oscillator model. And we started with this equation of motion at the top here, and we worked through a bunch of slides, and we ended up with the dielectric constant written in terms of these Lorentz parameters. We have a plasma frequency. This is sort of the switching frequency above which it becomes transparent. We have the damping term. This is responsible for loss. We have the restoring force term. That's the resonant frequency. And essentially, if we plot this, and we have a resonance at some frequency, this is what the dielectric constant looks like around that frequency. And so that's a very typical Lorentz response. What we'll see is these same things again from our metamaterials. Also recall the Drude model. It was the Lorentz oscillator model, but now the charges are not bound, they're free to move. We delete that restoring force term, and our equation differs a little bit. And what we see is below the plasma frequency, we have a very negative dielectric constant. The imaginary part goes through the roof, it's very lossy. Above the plasma frequency, it's essentially transparent. It's not a real sharp cutoff, but we train ourselves to think this way, that above the plasma frequency, metals are transparent. Below that, it's acting like a metal. But as you can see, it's not a sharp cutoff. Finally, on to the metamaterials. Here's one designed by Smith's group, and we see a capacitor. It makes sense, if it looks like a capacitor in the middle, that it will be storing its energy in terms of an electric field. So we would think of this as an electric resonance, and in fact this possesses a dielectric response. And if we look at the dielectric response on the right, taken from the reference I have at the bottom, that looks very Lorentz-like. And in fact it is. So what's happening here, we have an applied wave. It is storing an electric field there that can be released. It sets up an oscillation. As that secondary wave re-radiates, it combines with the applied wave out of phase, effectively slowing it down, and suddenly we have a dielectric response from a metamaterial. But now we can control the dimensions of the wires, the gap in the capacitor, the materials. We have physical control over what frequency we have that resonance, how strong it is, and we don't have that same control working with the atomic scale lattices. And it also turns out we can get much stronger behavior from a metamaterial than we can from an atomic scale lattice. The very famous split ring resonator. We see rings, so we can already envision this has circulating currents. This will be storing its energy primarily as a magnetic field. So we would say this has a magnetic resonance. And just like before, where we had an electric resonance, if you will, that gave us a permittivity. Here we have a magnetic resonance that gives rise to a permeability. And again, its response looks very Lorentz-like. And so there's this analogy between what gives ordinary materials their properties and what gives metamaterials their properties. And lastly, and this was one of the first things that were studied, if we have an array of wires, it turns out below a certain cutoff frequency, that behaves very much like a metal. Above this cutoff frequency, it becomes transparent, behaves more like a lossy dielectric. Well, that's acting very much like the plasma frequency did for metals. So in fact, an array of wires has what we call an artificial plasma frequency. However, Now we can control where that plasma frequency is through different structural parameters. So that's very neat. We can't engineer too much the size and shape of the atoms. They are what they are. But here we can engineer the physical features to place that plasma frequency wherever we want it. And then there's all the negative, positive parameter ways of classifying these things. So in my mind, the easiest, most straightforward metamaterials, the ones that give us properties most like the ordinary materials we're used to, are what we call double positive. They give us some kind of dielectric response or some kind of magnetic response, a permittivity or a permeability. These are still right-handed. These are the ordinary effective media type metamaterials. Then we have the single negative metamaterials, and it turns out these can be either left or right-handed, and we'll talk more about that later. But these are very good for artificial metals and also magnetic conductors. You'll see these arise again when we talk about hyperbolic metamaterials. There aren't too many folks exploring these for left-handedness simply because there has to be loss in the single negative metamaterials to be left-handed, whereas for the double negative, there does not in principle need to be loss in order to be left-handed. So in principle, a double negative material can have much lower loss. Now folks are still struggling with this. They are still very lossy, but they're beginning to do pretty good with that. So we would call a double negative metamaterial a left-handed media, and we'll discuss why that is in a little bit. It has a negative refractive index, which of course has consequences. And another neat thing, that means it has a negative thickness. So we would define the electrical length of something as refractive index times the actual physical length. If refractive index is negative, then suddenly these devices have negative electrical thickness. Then there's a whole class of refractive index less than 1 and epsilon near 0 type of metamaterials. And think about what happens there. Refractive index is that factor by which the speed of a wave slows down relative to the speed of light. And usually the refractive index is greater than 1. If it's less than 1, suddenly that a wave appears to be traveling faster than light could. On to probably the most famous topic in metamaterials is the left-handed metamaterials. So some time ago, Veselago really asked the question, what would happen if both the permeability and the permittivity were negative at the same time? So we would take the negative sign and associate it with the mu and the epsilon. I put this little tilde squiggly on top, meaning the squiggly mu, that's a positive quantity. I brought the negative sign out and wrote that explicitly. The next thing we'll do, we'll take these negative signs and associate it instead of with mu and epsilon, but with h. So in our top equation, we move the negative from the mu to the h. In the bottom equation, we move it from the epsilon over to the h on the left-hand side. Now for right-handed materials, E and H and K is the wave vector, that's the direction the wave is propagating, they're all at 90 degrees with respect to each other. Now certainly in some anisotropic materials that's not necessarily the case, but for most materials of interest, E, H, and K are all at 90 degrees with respect to each other, and E cross H is in the same direction as K. They form a right-handed system. Since we've associated here the negative sign with the H in a left-handed material, I guess we shouldn't call it left-handed yet, we have negative mu and epsilon, we associate the negative with the H, it actually changes the handedness of what used to be our right-handed system, and now we call it a left-handed system because E cross H now is in the opposite direction of K. And so now that obeys a left-handed rule, and we call these left-handed metamaterials. So let's think about what happens in a left-handed metamaterial. Ultimately, we want to show this has a negative refractive index. So what I'm drawing here, we have the interface between two different materials. So the top material might be air, And the material down here will be our left-handed material. It has both a negative mu and negative epsilon. So on the top, I am drawing the index ellipsoid for air, which is a sphere. And we're only drawing this in 2 dimensions, so we're looking at a cross-section of a sphere, so it's a circle. And this essentially is the dispersion surface. It's a map of the magnitude of our wave vector as a function of direction. And in air, no matter what direction a wave travels, it has the same refractive index, so that's why we have a circle here. So the vector connecting the origin to a point on the surface, that's our wave vector. So this blue line here, that is our incoming wave vector. Power is defined to be in a direction normal to the tangent of this surface. So for circles, the power and the phase are in the same direction. And this is how we're trained to think, that power and phase go in the same direction. Boundary conditions require that the transverse component of that wave vector is continuous across the interface. Well, what is the transverse component? We'll drop a projection down to our interface, our x-axis, and this orange line here, that's the transverse wave vector component. For convenience, we'll copy this over on the other side. Now in a left-handed material, we don't really associate the negative sign with H, but we have to associate with an E or H. Let's associate it actually with K. So that means that K should be going in the opposite direction that we would think. So in this ordinary configuration, the Y component of K we would think would be going down. However, because we're associating the negative sign with K, it's actually traveling this way. So phase will appear as if it's going upward. The wave really will be down here, but in terms of the phase and our sign convention here, we have to draw this going upward because we associate the negative sign with it. But because of boundary conditions, here's our transverse component of the wave vector. It has to be this. Well, since our wave vector is on the other side of the interface, that means our index ellipsoid for the second material, the material at the bottom, is also up here. Well, that index ellipsoid really, it's a map of the magnitude of K as a function of direction. If we know the frequency of the wave, that index ellipsoid really is a map of refractive index. We talked about this in earlier lectures. Since the index ellipsoid now is on the other side, that really implies this has a negative refractive index. And it turns out we need the negative refractive index really to describe refraction in these things. Let's think about the power. Well, we can't have power coming from nowhere. So the power that hits this interface has to keep propagating downward because that would violate causality otherwise. So the pointing vector is pointing in, but it's still normal to the surface, but pointing in the opposite direction of K. So in a left-handed metamaterial, power and phase are traveling in opposite directions. We need to discuss the conditions to have a negative refractive index. There's a lot of information on this slide here. It's commonly thought we have to have negative permeability and negative permittivity to have a left-handed material, and that's not quite true. There are other conditions that's summarized here. So we can characterize a wave propagating through a material or even a metamaterial with its wave vector K. And so what we show is a plot here where the horizontal axis is the real part of our wave vector, and then the vertical part is the imaginary part. So the larger the real part is, the more like a wave it's behaving. And if we have a very large imaginary part, that means it's decaying really quickly. So if we have large imaginary, that would be evanescent. And when we have a positive imaginary component, that's decaying. When we have a negative imaginary part, that's growing. And so what we see on this diagonal line, everything to the lower left of the diagonal is left-handed. And so what we can see is that these evanescent waves, which are typically decaying, if they're inside a left-handed material, they're actually growing, which is maybe a bit of a surprise. On this upper right hand is all of our right-handed materials. So this line separates right and left-hand materials, and you'll notice it relates the real and imaginary parts of mu and epsilon, the permeability and permittivity, and we define this line slashing this region in half, and to the lower left we have left-handed, on the upper right we have right-handed. But notice if we have just a single negative material, that this equation implies we have to have loss in order to be left-handed. So, and it comes from that equation. Now, if both are negative, certainly we see experimentally that our metamaterials are still lossy, but in principle, they don't have to have loss to be left-handed. So a lot more we could discuss here. My main point is really there's more ways to be left-handed other than having negative mu and epsilon. However, the focus really is on the negative mu and epsilon materials, the double negative metamaterials, because in principle they can be much lower loss. So it's a neat story how to realize a left-handed metamaterial. We know that we want a negative mu and negative epsilon, even though I just said there's some other conditions, but let's say we want a negative permittivity and a negative permeability. Well, we know how to get a negative permittivity. In fact, that was known for a long time. We can have a wire array. We get an artificial plasma frequency, and we get a very broad range of negative epsilons. What wasn't known for a long time was how to get a negative permeability, and this is really what Sir John Pendry figured out and gave the world in terms of the split ring resonator array. This has a very strong magnetic resonance, and it gives us certainly a region where the permeability is negative. So in this frequency band, we will have simultaneously a negative permeability, and if we combine it with a wire grid array, we will have also negative permittivity. So in fact, combining the split ring resonator with the wire grid array, that gives us the same range with a negative refractive index. And here's a picture of the device made at Duke University, and that was the world's first left-handed metamaterial. Well, usually the metallic elements are very lossy, so there is a lot of work now to realize left-handed metamaterials that don't have the same loss. So how are people doing that? Well, one's just coming up with better resonators that are a little bit more efficient, optimizing the geometry. And in my experience, that has somewhat limited success so far. Another area which actually is delivering quite a bit of success is incorporating gain. So let's have the losses in the metals and the metal resonators, but let's somehow incorporate into these gain, which will counteract the loss. And I think this leads to a rather complex or power-hungry device. I'd like to do this other ways, but this is definitely working. There's a lot of folks that are delivering quite a lot of success by incorporating gain. There's also an effect called electromagnetically induced transparency. Not a whole lot of folks working on that, more in the incorporating gain. However, there is also alternate designs. We don't have to have split ring resonators. There's other types of structures that can give us left-handedness without the loss. So one I'll point out are these S-shaped resonators. We can get a negative refractive index or be left-handed with relatively low loss. I'd certainly invite you to follow up on some of these papers to read about this. So what are some weird things that happen inside left-handed metamaterials? Well, one thing is Doppler shift is reversed. I keep meaning to make a sound file, but if there's a train coming at you, as it's coming at you, the sound has a higher pitch because it's compressing that acoustic wavefront, and it kind of sounds like ding, 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 and then it goes deep as it's passing you. That's a typical Doppler shift. Well, if air were made out of something left-handed, that shift would be reversed, and that would sound very weird, and someday I'll make a wave file to show that. This is not an area I've ever worked in, but there is something called Cherenkov radiation, and when we have charges that are traveling faster than the speed of light, turns out they emit photons, and there's a directionality associated with the photon emission relative to the velocity. Well, if this is happening inside of a left-handed metamaterial, it turns out the handedness of that radiation changes. It's the negative index. It's now emitting photons in the opposite direction that we would expect. And of course, if we have negative refractive index, we have negative refraction. So I grabbed these pictures off the internet. These are not things that I made. What would water look like if it had a negative refractive index? So there's a nice picture that somebody made here of what that would look like. And we mentioned that phase and power aren't necessarily in the same direction. And here's a good picture of this. So we have an ordinary material at the top. We can see our wave fronts, and our phase appears to be traveling in the direction of this laser pointer, and also the power seems to be going in that same direction as we would interpret. However, in a left-handed material or some other type of material, we have phase and energy going in different directions. Notice that our power is going off to the left, but if we track the wave fronts, the phase appears to be going this direction. So phase and power can go in different directions, and that's what it looks like. Usually when we talk about evanescent fields, we're talking about things that decay. Well, it turns out if refractive index is negative, what was evanescent is now a growing exponential wave. And that's very excited to imaging folks and folks that want to do manufacturing at the nano scale. So there are two things in imaging that people are looking at with negative refractive index materials. One is a very different kind of lens. So imagine we have an object and we have this rather flat square lens, but we have negative refraction. So the ray, instead of refracting along the blue dash line here and not focusing to an image point over here, it would just keep diverging. But we have negative refraction. So we have a focal point here, and we hit another interface, and then it would focus down and form an image. So just from a little old slab of material, standard slab, nothing else special, suddenly we get imaging. Another neat thing, if we have an object that's very, very small, it generates very, very high spatial frequencies that are normally cut off. They're cut off in air, and really we end up getting just a blurred image of the object because we need those higher spatial frequencies really to say what that object looks like. If we lose that, we get a blurring effect. Well, if those high spatial frequencies decay because they're evanescent, they're cut off, if suddenly we have a slab of something with a negative refractive index, the same evanescent field should grow. And in principle, we should be able to form an image with much better resolution. And so, in fact, that was done. And the group reference at the bottom here, they formed the words nano at a very small scale, and they imaged it twice. Once through a conventional imaging system, and these lines, these small lines, came through blurred. Well, imaging this through something with a negative refractive index, these lines were much narrower. So they were resolved much more sharply. So in fact, that really did confirm that, yeah, in a negative index material, these evanescent waves are growing. We can recover them, assuming there's enough power in them to be recovered, and we can do this perfect type of imaging. Our next topic, refractive index less than 1, and this brings us into cloaking and invisibility. So let's think about what really needs to happen with cloaking. We have an area where we want to hide an object. So that means if we have a wave, here's the wave front and traveling left to right, it has to bend around that object such that after it passes through it, it reconstructs that wave front. And we probably have air out here. Well, if we have air on the outside, that means this part of the wavefront at the very edge is traveling at the speed of light, and we can't break that limit, right? Well, think about what happens to the power at this part of the wavefront. It enters here and actually has to traverse around the object and back out again. So in fact, this little piece of the wavefront, if you will, travels a longer distance than this part of the wavefront, yet it has to come out at the same time. So in fact, it has to exceed the speed of light. We have to have refractive index less than 1 in order to achieve invisibility. And there's been a really rich exchange of papers online about how it's impossible. No, it is possible. And the folks at Duke actually demonstrated this. Another neat thing is something has a negative refractive index. It also has a negative thickness. Well, suppose we have some kind of multi-layer thin film optical filter, if you will, and this produces a passband at some wavelength or some frequency. It turns out this structure is angle sensitive. Depending what angle we come in, the frequency or the color that we get on the other side changes because it's angle sensitive. We come in at an angle, these layers look effectively larger or smaller, and so that changes how that multi-layer filter would behave. So that's a problem. We don't want that. And we also don't want to solve it using films that have 1 to 200 layers, which it's possible to do. We'd rather just have a few layers and not have it be sensitive to angle of incidence. So think about what the source of that problem is. We come in at an angle, the layers appear effectively thicker. So the layers are essentially changing size with angle of incidence, the effective size, if you will. Well, if we introduce something with a negative refractive index, with a negative thickness, those negative thicknesses can combine with positive thicknesses to give us overall a device with zero thickness. Well, if it has zero thickness, then it can't be sensitive to angle of incidence. So the idea is, in an intermediate layer here, we would put in some kind of left-handed or negative refractive index metamaterial so that the overall device has zero thickness. If we do that, in principle, over all these angles, we would get the same frequency through. The position of our stop band or pass band of the filter would not shift. So modeling this and plotting the frequency as the angle of incidence changes, so for the standard filter, where this intermediate layer is our standard positive index material, we see the transmission wavelength actually shifting quite significantly. When we inject a negative refractive index material so that the device has overall zero thickness, we see very, very little fluctuation in the position of that pass band. That's very interesting. We have now rendered a device independent of angle of incidence using something with negative refractive index. And on to our last class of metamaterials that we'll discuss. These are the non-resonant types. And we'll talk about two, hyperbolic and anisotropic, although we could argue that the hyperbolic are even a subclass of the anisotropic. Recall our lecture on subwavelength gratings, and we said those are actually artificially anisotropic media. And we explained that in terms of where the power is. For one polarization, the power kind of shifts or prefers to be in the dielectric. For the other, it's more evenly distributed, and so overall they see an overall different effective dielectric constant. So if we take that same concept now and extend it to 3 dimensions, we can draw what we would call anisotropic metamaterials. Now these two would be uniaxial metamaterials because we have 2 directions with the same dielectric constant. Imagine the electric field oscillating in the vertical direction, and horizontally, it really is seeing the same lattice. However, an electric field oscillating in this direction sees an entirely different lattice and would have a different dielectric constant. So these two have uniaxial symmetry. And in fact, our research in our group, this is what we're playing with most, is the uniaxial metamaterials. So if we look at the difference in the effective dielectric constants, we call that birefringence. So in something uniaxial, it would have an ordinary dielectric constant and an extraordinary dielectric constant. Optics people refer to this as ordinary refractive index and extraordinary refractive index. So if we subtract the ordinary from the extraordinary, we will get some kind of delta epsilon. And this gives us a measure of how strong or how much birefringence, how much anisotropy this particular metamaterial will give us. And because we're subtracting 2 things, it turns out we could have negative or positive birefringence. Usually the extraordinary is bigger than the ordinary, but that doesn't have to be the case. We can turn that around and we'll see that on the next slide. So up here on the upper right, is what I call the anisotropy cheat sheet. So remember this gray block, this is one unit cell of a grating. The blue arrows here are the alignment of the electric field as it passes through this grating. So when we have the field polarized parallel to the surface, we see the highest dielectric constant. When we have the electric field polarized perpendicular to the grating, we see the lowest effective dielectric constant. Remember, the wave is going from top down. So based on this little cheat sheet, we can figure out what type of birefringence these two structures will have. So let's take a look at this lattice. We have a field oscillating up and down this way and this way. We would call those the ordinary axes. And notice here we have the electric field punching into interfaces. So that kind of looks like this case. And in fact, the ordinary dielectric constant for this structure is the lower one. Now imagine the electric field oscillating in this direction. It's parallel to the interfaces. That is this case where we have the high dielectric constant. So in fact, both of these lattices would give us positive birefringence. It also turns out that this particular one, if we have high refractive index or high dielectric constant rods in a low index medium, this gives us larger birefringence than this other case, but both will work. Well, what if we want negative birefringence? How would we do that? So let's look at this lattice. The electric field now oscillating either horizontally or vertically is now mostly parallel to interfaces. Well, if it's parallel to interfaces, those two directions will see a high dielectric constant. The electric field oscillating in this direction is punching through interfaces, so it looks more like this case with the low dielectric constant. So in fact, the extraordinary direction here sees the lower dielectric constant, and we have negative birefringence. So thinking along these lines, we really can just intuitively sculpt some kind of structure to give us whatever type of anisotropy we want. And then we can go back to our electromagnetic models to refine the dimensions to maximize or minimize whatever we're looking to do. We did a brief study on how to maximize the birefringence of a positive uniaxial metamaterial. We looked at square arrays, we looked at oblique arrays, hexagonal arrays, and different patterns of structures within these things, trying to optimize the amount of birefringence. What we found is that a hexagonal array of hexagonal shaped rods gave us the strongest or the highest birefringence. I don't want to say this is the absolute strongest birefringent material, but it's the strongest that we found. It's only slightly weaker if we have round rods in a hexagonal array. So because this is a lot easier, we tend to go with a hexagonal array of round rods. If we invert the lattice, we get weaker anisotropy. If we go to a square array, we also get weaker anisotropy. So hexagonal shaped rods in a hexagonal array where the rods have the higher dielectric constant or higher refractive index and a low dielectric constant host, that's the best case for getting anisotropy. Then we want to optimize the dimensions. And in our lattice, because we 3D printed this, it had to be freestanding. We had to stick in other little supports here. Really, to be truly hexagonal, there should be another support coming out the sides. We wanted to try to minimize that, so we only used two. So strictly speaking, this would be biaxial, but very weakly biaxial. And as long as these little support rods here are thin enough, it is essentially still uniaxial. But technically, this would be a biaxial crystal, a biaxial metamaterial. So given these, we want to optimize all these different parameters and to try to get the strongest amount of anisotropy. And of course, what we found is this dimension T should be 0. So electromagnetically, we don't want those there. Structurally, we have to have them there, so we're forced to have some T. So the rule of thumb is we make these supports just as thin as we possibly can, that it still can support itself and form well. Well, what about the size of the rods? And what we found is somewhere around an 80% fill fraction, or the rod radius of 0.4 times the lattice constant, really independent of what material we're using, we found that's about the case. So that was an interesting conclusion. So about an 80% fill fraction is where we see the strongest birefringence. So we 3D printed some of these, and we had to 3D print them in 3 different orientations because we have 3 different tensor elements that we'd want to measure, and we stuck them in waveguides and measured the scattering and back calculated the effective dielectric constant, and that matched our models reasonably well. So we moved on to other things. Well, other than 3D printing, optics folks also had some ways to make things artificially anisotropic. There's a process called auto-cloning, where you would start off with a diffraction grating and you deposit alternating layers of different materials, probably low index, high index, low index, high index. And if the process parameters are right, we get this sort of self-shaping effect. And in fact, it maintains the profile of the grating a little bit, and it converges to these triangle type shapes. And in principle, we could deposit any number of layers, they would stay triangles. It turns out that's an anisotropic material, and we can do that at optical frequencies. Let's think more about this cutoff frequency. I mentioned with these non-resonant type of metamaterials, the lattice spacing can be a millionth of a wavelength. It can be very, very, very small. So they work from DC all the way up to a cutoff. What is that cutoff? So we go back to the band diagrams for this hexagonal array, and we see 2 different lines. We see the blue lines and the green lines. What I did here is I took the refractive index in the unit cell and averaged it and calculated the bands for that homogeneous unit cell, and that's the green lines. So at least the green line right here we can interpret as the light line. The blue bands are the actual lattice. So when the blue bands deviate from the green bands, that means we're starting to get some kind of resonance within the lattice. So I'm looking where the green line starts to deviate from the blue bands, and maybe somewhere around 0.15. So I would say that's the cutoff. Above that, we have something more acting like a photonic crystal. Below this, we have something acting more like a metamaterial, a non-resonant phenomenon happening. This is the E mode, as we discussed last semester. If we do this for the other polarization, our H mode, well, we see the cutoff at a much lower frequency. And so if we want this to operate for both polarizations, we take the worst case, and in fact the H mode, or what we would call the TE polarization, tends to dominate the cutoff frequency. But really we're defining the cutoff frequency where the lattice is not resonant. Once that starts happening, a different set of physics takes over. We start having wave scattering and interference. Below that, it's really just where the power is in the lattice, as we discussed in the subwavelength grating lecture. So here's a neat thing that some folks are working on called Dyakonov surface waves. This is a surface wave supported at the interface between 2 materials where at least one is anisotropic. And there's other conditions for the existence. A very popular one that a lot of folks have studied is where we have a uniaxial substrate and an isotropic superstrate. And it turns out this is uniaxial, so it has an ordinary and an extraordinary refractive index. This superstrate should have a refractive index somewhere between the ordinary and extraordinary in the substrate. When that's the case, we'll get some narrow cone of angles called the existence domain, and in this direction, that's where the surface wave is supported. So a surface wave would not be propagating in this direction. It would only propagate within this cone of angles called the existence domain, and this is pretty small. And there's a lot of folks working on how to make that broader with building in loss and other types of things. But so if we wanted to use this surface wave to do anything, we could use a metamaterial to realize the uniaxial anisotropy that's needed in the substrate. And these also exist with certain biaxial configurations, and again, we can use metamaterials. One thing we are researching, we found, well, let me back up a little bit. Around all electric devices, there's this near field or reactive field. It's the fields that are stuck to that device that aren't radiating anywhere. So imagine you charge a capacitor, There's field lines between the plates. They're not radiating, they're not going anywhere, but they certainly are there. So all electric devices have this sort of near field reactive field. Think of it as a cloud surrounding an electric device. If we bring two devices in close proximity, they interfere and they couple. And so that's normally a bad thing. So we found that if we embed an electric device in an anisotropic material, that the near field around that device can change its shape. And in fact, it tends to follow the direction that has the highest dielectric constant. So what we're showing here is a standard microstrip. And so here's our ground plane, here's our signal trace, and our substrate material. And I'm drawing the isocontour